What is going on, you guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be jumping into a fairly new stack called the T3 stack. And with that, we'll be building an AI journaling tool which will evaluate your journal entries. So for example, if you have a journal entry which is somewhat positive, it'll pick up that it's positive. If it's negative, it'll pick up that it's negative. But first, what is the T3 stack? Now, the T3 stack was initially developed by Theo, or T3.gg on Twitter/X, and it provides a streamlined and efficient development experience for building full stack TypeScript applications. Now, it's built up of the following. We have Next.js at its core. We have TypeScript, we have TRPC, we have Prisma, NextAuth, and Tailwind CSS. So first, with Next.js, this is the core of the stack. And for those of you who don't know what Next.js is, it is a React-based framework that enables functionality such as server-side rendering and generating static websites for React-based web applications. This is where both our front end and our back end is going to live. Then we have TypeScript. Now, TypeScript is an open source language. Many of you may have heard of it. Some of you may be quite familiar with it, which builds upon JavaScript by adding static types. It helps in easier code analysis and safer refactoring, which is beneficial for large code bases. And also, I guess it's starting to become like the industry standard when it comes to building what used to be JavaScript applications. Then we have TRPC, which may be something new for a lot of people's vocabulary, and that's a library for building end-to-end type-safe APIs, facilitating the communication between client and server, and it ensures type safety along the way. Then we have Prisma, and Prisma is an open source database toolkit that replaces traditional ORMs, making database access easy with a strongly typed data access client. Then we have NextAuth.js, which is a library for enabling authentication in Next.js. So we don't have to really mess around with setting up too much authentication in our application, as that can be quite a tedious but also tiring job. And we just want to get straight into building, have authentication in there, as most web applications nowadays require that. And finally, we have Tailwind CSS, which is a utility-first CSS framework that allows developers to build custom designs quickly and efficiently, so we don't have to deal with, writing vanilla CSS. But you are not confined to the entire stack. Although it's made up of 6 different pieces, when initializing the stack, as we will see later on, we can choose whether or not we want Tailwind, Prisma, TRPC, and NextAuth. However, for this video, we will be using all of them, as I want to cover the entire T3 stack with you guys. What else will we be using? Well, for our AI journaling app, we'll also be using Supabase, and this is where we will host our Postgres database. And Supabase is free, so you can sign up to it for free. If you want to use your own database, feel free to. For this tutorial, I'm just going to use Supabase as it's a popular choice. I've had great experience with it in the past, and it's also Postgres based, so who doesn't love Postgres? And finally, for our AI side, we'll be leveraging OpenAI's API, which is the same company behind ChatGPT. So when we send off our journal entries, we'll get the AI to give us like a sentiment on the journal entry itself. However, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So to get started, we first need to initialize our T3 application. Now I'm on the create.t3.gg website. I will add that link in the description. This is basically the home of the T3 stack where all the docs are. It's still under development, so I guess I'll be adding more and more to it over time. However, the command that we're interested in is this npm create t3 at latest. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. If you're using Yarn, I guess there is a workaround around for it. And with the same goes for pnpm. I'm not 100% sure, but in this case, we're just going to go ahead and use npm. So let's head back, and I'm in my terminal in a directory where I'm going to create my project. Just going to paste that in, hit enter. And the first thing that it's going to ask is, what do you want your project to be called? I'm just going to call it grnl and then -app, bit of a quirky name. Will we be using TypeScript or JavaScript? Now, you can select JavaScript if you want. However, given that this whole application is built around type safety and that holds it at #1 priority, if you do hit JavaScript, you'll get a funny prompt, which is telling you that TypeScript, that's the wrong answer and it will default to TypeScript. I'm just going to hit TypeScript anyway, but please feel free to do that. It's quite a funny little gimmick that they've added in. Will you be using Tailwind CSS for styling? Yes, as we don't want to write vanilla CSS. Would you like to use TRPC? Yes. What authentication provider would you like to use? In our case, we're interested in nextauth.js. You can, of course, use other authentication providers if you want. For the course of this video, we'll be using nextauth.js. What database ORM would you like to use? We can pick none if we don't need a database. There's also Drizzle, which I think is a new addition that has been added in. But we're going to use Prisma in our case. Should we initialize a Git repository and stage changes? Yes, as it's good practice. Should we run npm install for you? Yes. And what import alias would you like to use? I think by default they use a tilde /. In my case, I like to use the @ and then /. So I'm going to hit enter on that. All right, so just give that a second as it sets it all up. Remember, it's also going to install it all for you. And then let's have a look at what the project structure is like. All right, so I've gone ahead and opened up the project in VS Code. You can use whatever text editor you like, but we have this initial setup. So already it's added like a bunch of different files and folders into it. So let's have a quick overview of what we have. The first thing is our Prisma file, Prisma folder. And in there we have the schema.prisma, which is when you're using Prisma, you have this file and this is where you define your models. So it's already added an example one in there. We also have one that represents an account. And this is automatically added if you select the nextauth.js file. So if you don't, or option, so if you don't select that, then you won't have this model. Then we have session, as we have database sessions for our users. Then we have our model for our user, and then the verification token. And yeah, so that's our Prisma file. And then we have, of course, our public file where right now we only have our fav icon. And then we have our source. And this is where like the majority of, or this is where we'll basically be working for most of the time. Now we have the pages file, and in here we have our index, so our home page, our _app, so like the page where everything is loaded into it, if you're familiar with Next.js. Then we have our API, and this isn't the backend API, this is the API that we interact with. So this is the way in which we will access our backend. And in there, auth has already been set up for us. And our interaction with TRPC. So it covers a lot of the boilerplate for us. We don't have to set up, in fact, a lot of things. We just have to set up our credentials, which we'll do in a second. And then we have our server, and this is where our backend actually is. So we have our db.ts file. This is just to make sure that we have a clean interaction with our database, that we don't leave open any connections. We have our auth file. Again, sorts out our authentication, and it by default uses Discord provider. We won't be using that in this case. For us, we'll be using GitHub. And then we have our API folder within our server, and in there we have our routers, and this is where we create our endpoints, and we'll be doing that. And of course, this video is not an intro to TRPC. I'm going to assume that you have some idea of what it is, or you can kind of follow along and get an idea of what we're doing. But to quickly kind of give you an idea of how this is built. So we have our first endpoint, and you can call this like our hello endpoint. This is a public endpoint, so you can access this without being an authenticated user. And that comes right out of the box, so we don't have to deal with endpoint or our APIs having like authentication added in there. So this is a great feature of the T3 stack. It deals with an input, so we're passing in a text object or an object that needs a text, which is set to a string type, and this typing is coming from a library called Zod. And then all this does is the response is just a greeting, and that greeting is hello, and then whatever the input was. Then we have another one, which is a get all, and that's showing an example of how you can use or you can access the database. And then we have a get secret message, which is only for authenticated users. All right, so and you'll see all this in action. And yeah, if you're looking at this and you have some experience with backend already, then you may be looking at this and thinking, this is fantastic. Like all of this stuff is already set up, and it also provides us with some great examples of how we can get straight into using TRPC. Now we have our route, and this is where we register our routers. So right now, only the example route is being used. And that's pretty much it for the server. Then we have our styles, which just contains our globals.css file. Not too much to worry there. And our utils file, which we don't actually have to deal with at all. So there's no real point going over that. You can, of course, read this if you want to. You may have to change it depending on what you're building in the future. And then we have our env.mjs file. And this is great because it makes sure that we have the right environment variables there. So if we're missing something, let's say we don't have a Discord client, it will complain about that, or client secret. And we'll be making use of this to make sure that all the environment variables are included in our project. And then we have, of course, our prettier files, our Tailwind config file, all of that is set up. And that's pretty much the boilerplate that comes with the T3 stack. All right, so now that kind of just covers that. The next thing we need to do is set up our database. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we will be using Supabase. So let's go ahead and set that up. So over in my browser, I've already signed up to Supabase. You can access it by going to supabase.com. You can log in with your GitHub if you like. I already have like a couple tables or databases already in there. But to get started, I'm just going to go ahead and click on a new project. So just here. What am I going to name it? Let's call it Journal App. The password, I'm just going to generate a password, copy that anyway. And I don't mind showing you guys, as I trust you guys, but in all seriousness, I will be deleting this afterwards. I'm just going to throw that into my .env file for now, so I don't forget it. And region, pick the region that you're closest to. So in my case, it will be West EU London. I don't know why it says EU in that case, because we're no longer in the EU, but anyway. But if you're in Germany, I guess you'd select Frankfurt, or in India, Mumbai. So just pick the one that's closest to you, as it just makes it a bit faster in order to access it. And then click on Create New Project. Now this will take maybe a minute or so to complete, but afterwards we can go ahead and use those credentials to add in our database to our Prisma. All right, so the project is now set up. So we're all up and running on Supabase. So you should see something like this, where you have the welcome to your new project along with your project name. Now, what we need is, if we go back to our prisma.schema, first of all, we'll be using a Postgres database. And right now it's configured to SQLite. So the first thing we need to do is set that to Postgres, like so. It has a note here for MySQL or SQL Server that you need to comment out the db.text. So these guys here. In our case, we don't care because we're using Postgres. But if you are going to be using MySQL or SQL Server, just make sure you take this into account. The next thing that we need is a database URL, which we don't have right now, but let's go ahead and get that from Supabase. Now down here, if we go to project settings, and I think into API, we have our, is it there or is it database? I think in database, so click on database, and if you go down, you will see the connection string, and then you have the Node.js one, and just take that one, copy it, go back, and inside env, just paste that in where we have a database URL. So I'm just going to paste that in. Let me just shrink that. And then for your password, just take your old password, copy that, and then paste that in. And of course, I'm showing my password to you guys. Don't ever do that. if you're sharing with another person or a third party, because, you know, security reasons. But I'm going to delete this anyway. But that pretty much sets up our database URL. Now, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and add our models to our database. So if we go back to Supabase and go to our table editor, we see that we have no tables, and it's asking us to even create a new one. Don't touch any of that stuff. We're going to be doing all of this through Prisma. So what we need to do with Prisma is we need to migrate all of this onto our new database. So open up a new terminal and make sure you're inside the project. Now, what we're going to type is npx and then Prisma and then migrate dev. Hit enter. So you can see already that it's taken into account that we're using Postgres and the database URL that we use. You can see it with the Supabase. Then enter a name for the new migration. I'm just going to call it initial. Hit enter. And there you go. Your database is now in sync with your schema. And what you'll notice is that if you open up your project explorer, you'll have a new file called, or folder called migrations. And in there, you'll have the one that you just created. It's timestamped and then it has the name of it right next to it. So it's here 2023 and then initial and then migration.sql, and it generates the SQL command for it. So as you can see, it's created a table, for example, one for account, another for session and user, etc. Now, if we go back to Supabase and then just hit refresh, or it automatically refreshes for you, you'll see that we now have these new tables: account, example, session, user, verification token, whatever. But all of that has been added in for us. It's migrated it, so our database is now up and running. But let's go ahead and populate some of this stuff. So we have our database set up. The next thing we need to do is add in our authentication, and we'll be using GitHub for that. So the first thing we need to do when it comes to setting up our GitHub authentication is, let's just close this. So we can see that we need a client ID and client secret. Right now it's just asking for Discord, and we're not going to be using Discord in our example. So let's go ahead and in the env.mjs file, we can first of all state that we want a GitHub one. So I'm just going to get rid of this Discord client stuff. In fact, I'm just going to add in, instead of saying Discord, I'm just going to replace that with GitHub. And the same also goes for client secret. All right, so now it expects a GitHub client ID and a GitHub client secret. And it's complaining because if you scroll down, it still thinks that we're looking for Discord. So just replace this with GitHub client ID and GitHub client secret. And then in the process.env file, we need to replace this with GitHub client ID. Make sure you spelt it correctly, as this can throw you off if you haven't. And then client secret, like so. All right, so that's our env.mjs file sorted out. And again, this is just ensuring that we have the right values in our env file. It can be super helpful, especially when you forget that you haven't added in like a certain environment variable. But all right, we can close that now. The next thing that we need to do is if we go into the auth.ts file, and that can be found inside server and then auth.ts. Let me just shrink all of this so you guys get a better view. And you can see already it's complaining that we don't have the Discord client ID and client secret, which is good. It helps us. And we also don't need this Discord provider, which comes with next auth. So instead, let's go ahead and import the GitHub one. So import GitHub provider from next auth /providers/GitHub. Nice. So we can get rid of this Discord provider one. And down where we have our Discord ones, let's just replace that with GitHub provider. And then in the env, let's replace that with GitHub clients ID and GitHub client secret. And I hope you guys already are seeing like the benefits of having this type checking, this type safety involved in the T3 stack, as it just makes the development experience so much more easier. So that's our auth.ts file done. Now we have set up, oh, and finally, let's just quickly in the env file, let's just replace the Discord parts with GitHub. All right. Let's head over to GitHub. So I've already logged into GitHub over here, and go ahead and if you click on your profile, you should get a link which sends you to settings. So click on settings, and then if you go down, you'll see the section right at the bottom of the side panel, a developer settings one. Just click on that, and then click on OAuth apps. And then within that, click on a new OAuth app. All right, so first it's gonna ask for a name for your application. I'm gonna go ahead and call this journal app. And then we need a homepage URL, and just type in http://localhost and then colon 3000. This is for development. So if you were going to deploy this, you would use the URL of your application. I'm just going to call this dev in that case. So http://localhost:3000, and then the authorization callback, which if you're using next auth, then the endpoint is going to be localhost and then 3000 and then /API/auth/callback/GitHub. I'm just going to zoom in just in case you guys can't see that. So remember, homepage URL, we have the port 3000, and then authorization callback, we have /API/auth/callback/GitHub. And when deploying, this part here is going to be replaced with your URL. So you'd probably create a new OAuth application. All right, so just zoom back out of that and register application. So once you've done that, you'll get a client ID, which is exactly what we need, and a client secret. So first, I'm just going to go ahead and copy the client ID, copy that, go back to my code, throw that in here where it's asking for the ID, save, go back and generate a new client secret. Again, a client secret is something that you would not want to share with a third party. So I'm sharing mine, of course. I will delete it, don't worry. And then head back and then just paste that in as well. Hit save. And that's pretty much our authentication all set up. So we didn't have to go into the hassle of setting up API endpoints and making sure that we're generating tokens with other libraries and all that. All of this is just taken care of by NextAuth. So what we can do now is go ahead and run our application. So let's hit npm run dev and give it a second. And we have our localhost 3000. I'm just going to go ahead and click on it. Didn't redirect this time around. Oh, it added it into another browser. Let me just paste that in here. And here we go. We have our create T3 boilerplate code that's showing up. We have hello from TRPC, and we also have this nice sign in button. Let's go ahead and click on it, and it's saying sign in with GitHub. And as it knows that we're asking for GitHub sign in, if you had Google, if you had Discord, you would get sign in with Discord or Google. So just click on that, and it's saying authorize journal app dev with my GitHub account as I'm already logged in, saying that the authorizing will redirect to the homepage. Hit authorize, and it's taking us back now. And here we go. We go logged in as Farhan Ali. You can now see the secret message. And if you remember the secret message, if we go back and we go into our server, into our API, into our routers, and example.ts, we get this get secret message. You can now see this secret message, and that's because this was a protected procedure, meaning that only authenticated users can access it. But that pretty much sums up setting up our T3 application. We can already sign in and out of our application. So if we click sign out, we're back to square one, back to our sign in page, our home page with our authentication. And that's pretty much it. And I really want to know what your take is on this entire process so far. We will be building on this, and we'll get started with building our AI journaling application. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I hope to see you in the next video.